The rain fell on the city like a judgment. It slicked the asphalt and blurred the neon lights of the Starlight Diner into a watercolor of lonely promises. Inside, it was warm, smelling of coffee and burnt sugar. Outside, where Jinwoo Park stood, it was a cold, unforgiving world that saw only the surface of things. And his surface was filth. His tattered white shirt, stained with the grime of a week spent on the streets, clung to his skin. His hair was matted, his face obscured by a beard he'd painstakingly neglected. He was a ghost at the feast, a walking embodiment of everything the warm, comfortable people inside paid to forget. He pushed the glass door open, a small bell announcing his unwelcome arrival. A wave of silence washed over the diner. Conversations faltered. Forks paused midair. Every eye landed on him, and every eye was a stone. The manager, a portly man with a tight collar and an even tighter smile, barreled toward him. His name tag read Mr. Fletcher. Whoa, hold on there, Fletcher said, holding up his hands as if to ward off a foul disease. We can't have you in here.
Out.
Now, Jinwoo didn't move. He let the humiliation wash over him, a familiar baptism of fire he had chosen for himself. He was testing the world, or perhaps just himself. He lowered his gaze to the floor, playing the part. Please, he rasped, his voice a dry crackle. Just some leftovers. Anything. Fletcher's face contorted in disgust. Leftovers? This is a place of business, not a charity ward. You're scaring my customers. He gestured around the room, and the patrons nodded in silent, fearful agreement. They saw a threat, a problem, a piece of human refuse that had drifted in from the storm. But then, across the room, Jinwoo saw her. A young waitress, polishing glasses behind the counter. She was beautiful, with eyes that held a depth that seemed to absorb the entire sordid scene without flinching. Her uniform was a simple white shirt and a red apron, but she wore it with a quiet dignity. Her name tag said Imani. She didn't look at him with pity, that cheap currency of the comfortable. She looked at him with something that felt dangerously like understanding. And in that single, fleeting glance, Jinwoo knew his entire experiment, his entire painful pilgrimage, hinged on her. Jinwoo Park was not a beggar. He was a king in rags, the chairman of Park Global Holdings, a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate that had, just last week, quietly acquired the entire Starlight Diner franchise. The acquisition was a footnote in his vast portfolio, a sentimental purchase. This very diner chain was the first business his grandfather had ever bought in America, the cornerstone of an empire built on the philosophy that a company's true worth was measured in its humanity, not its revenue. A philosophy Jinwoo feared was dead. Wealth had become a cage, insulating him from the world, surrounding him with people who mirrored his own success back at him in 1,000 flattering but empty reflections. His trust had been shattered 6 months ago when his most loyal executive, a man who spoke of corporate family and shared values, was caught systematically embezzling millions. The betrayal wasn't the money. It was the lie. It made Jinwoo question everything. Was anyone genuine? Or was every interaction, every smile, every handshake, simply a transaction? So, he had shed his custom-tailored suits, his penthouse apartment, his identity. He had walked into the wilderness of the city streets to find a single, irrefutable piece of evidence that his grandfather's ideals weren't just the nostalgic ramblings of an old man. He needed to feel the cold indifference of the world to know if any warmth was real. He chose this diner, the oldest in the chain, as his testing ground. He watched the cogs of the machine from the outside. He saw Mr. Fletcher berate a young busboy for dropping a fork, his voice dripping with condescension. He saw another waitress, Brenda, roll her eyes at a family that struggled to calculate a tip, her contempt a poison in the air. The place was efficient, profitable, and utterly soulless. It ran on fear and quiet desperation. Jinwoo felt a hunger that had nothing to do with the food cooking on the grill. It was a hunger for truth, a desperate craving for a single act of kindness that wasn't motivated by personal gain. A love without benefits, as his grandfather used to say. As he sat there, being stared at, He felt the weight of his own empire pressing down on him. He owned the walls, the tables, the very air they breathed, yet he was an outcast within it. Fletcher shoved him backward, forcing him out into the relentless downpour. The glass door slammed shut, a final, definitive punctuation to his rejection. Jin-woo stumbled, catching himself on the wet brick wall. The rain plastered his thin shirt to his body, and a deep, bone-aching chill set in. He was an actor in a play of his own design, but the misery was no longer an act. Through the large window, streaked with rain, the diner looked like a different world. A warm, bright terrarium of human connection from which he was excluded. He saw a father ruffle his son's hair, a young couple sharing a milkshake, their laughter fogging the glass. These simple moments of grace felt a universe away. Mr. Fletcher came out the back door to haul a large, black bag to the dumpster. He saw Jin-woo huddled under the awning and sneered. "Still here? I thought I told you to leave. Don't you have a gutter to be in?" His words were sharp and jagged, meant to wound. Jin-woo flinched, not from the insult, but from the casual cruelty behind it. Brenda appeared at the door, wiping her hands on her apron, a smug look on her face. "He's bad for the brand, Mr. Fletcher. People will think we encourage this." Jin-woo ignored them, his eyes fixed on the dumpster. A customer had just thrown away a half-eaten bag of food. As he took a weak step toward it, a glint of hope in his manufactured despair, Fletcher's polished black shoe shot out, kicking the bag into a murky puddle. "Vermin," the manager spat, the word hanging in the damp air. "We don't feed rats," that was it. The absolute nadir. In that moment, Jin-woo felt the crushing weight of his experiment. What was he even doing here? Proving that the world was as ugly as he suspected? Was this journey into the abyss just a form of self-punishment? He had wanted to find the soul of his company, and all he had found was a rotten core, a balance sheet where human dignity was the first expense to be cut. The cold was no longer just in his bones. It was in his heart. The storm outside was nothing compared to the tempest of disillusionment raging within him. The diner's side door creaked open, cutting through the monotonous drumming of the rain. It was Imani. Her shift was over. She held a white styrofoam box in her hands, clutching it to her chest like a precious secret. She didn't look at the puddle, or the kicked-away food, or the sneering faces of her colleagues still visible through the door. She looked only at him. Her eyes, deep and clear, held no judgment. They held a profound, aching sorrow, a shared understanding of a world that could be needlessly cruel. She walked over to him, her step certain, unafraid. She stopped just before him, the steam from the box warming the small space between them. "You must be hungry," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the noise of the city, a clear, simple note of truth. Without waiting for a response, she opened the box. It wasn't scraps. It wasn't leftovers somebody had picked over. It was a full meal. A perfectly cooked cheeseburger, a generous pile of golden fries, and a small side of coleslaw. It was the employee meal she had packed to take home, her own dinner after a long and thankless shift. Jin-woo stared at the food, then at her. This was not part of the script. This was an uncalculated act of grace. "I can't," he whispered, the words catching in his throat. "Please," she insisted, pushing the box into his hands. "Everyone deserves a hot meal." No matter what, her gaze was unwavering. It was not the performative kindness of charity. It was the quiet solidarity of one struggling soul to another. As he took the box, his fingers brushed against hers. He saw the exhaustion etched around her eyes, the slight tremble in her hands. He knew, with a certainty that transcended his disguise, that she didn't have much. Tucked into the pocket of her worn coat, he could see the edge of a crumpled piece of paper. A grocery list. The words milk and bread were visible. This offering wasn't from a place of abundance. It was a sacrifice. It was her food, her comfort, her small reward at the end of a hard day, and she was giving it to him. In that moment, Jin-woo found what he was looking for. The single, irrefutable piece of evidence. The world was not entirely cold. A flame was still burning, right here in the rain, in the heart of a waitress who gave away her dinner to a stranger. Before Jinwoo could even take a bite, the diner door flew open with a violent bang. Mr. Fletcher stood there, his face a mask of incandescent rage. He had been watching from the window, his little kingdom's order disrupted by an unsanctioned act of mercy. "Imani, what in God's name do you think you're doing?" he roared, his voice echoing in the alley. "I told you not to engage with him. He is not our problem." He strode toward them, his presence sucking the air out of the small space. Brenda hovered in the doorway, a vulture enjoying the spectacle. The few remaining customers turned in their booths, their faces pressed against the glass, silent witnesses to the unfolding drama. Imani stood her ground, placing herself slightly in front of Jinwoo, a subconscious act of protection. "It's my food, Mr. Fletcher. The meal I paid for with my employee discount." Her voice was quiet but firm, a stark contrast to his booming fury. "I don't care if you bought it with gold bullion," he spat, his face turning a blotchy red. "You are wearing our uniform. You represent this establishment. And your association with this filth is damaging to our brand. You're fired." The words hung in the air, as cold and sharp as broken glass. "You're fired. Go clean out your locker. I want you gone in 5 minutes." For the first time, Imani's composure cracked. It wasn't defiance that showed on her face, but the raw, visceral pain of injustice. Her eyes welled up with tears, not of self-pity, but of disbelief that a simple act of human kindness could cost her everything. She had a family to support. That crumpled grocery list in her pocket was not a suggestion, it was a map of survival. And he had just torn it to pieces. Jinwoo watched, the warm food in his hands turning to ash in his mouth. He saw the silent, gossiping faces in the window. They weren't villains, they were just an audience, consuming this small tragedy as part of their evening's entertainment. The storm was coming. No, the storm was already here, and he was about to become its eye. Slowly, deliberately, Jinwoo placed the box of food on a dry patch of concrete. He rose to his feet. The shivering beggar, the hunched and broken man, was gone. In his place stood someone else. His posture straightened, his shoulders squared, and the weary, downcast gaze was replaced by an electrifying intensity. He looked directly at Mr. Fletcher, and for the first time, the manager saw not a vagrant to be dismissed, but an authority to be feared. A cold, calculating intelligence burned in his eyes, a fire that had been banked but never extinguished. "You're right about one thing, Mr. Fletcher," Jinwoo said. His voice was different now. It was clear, resonant, and carried the unmistakable weight of command. "She does represent this diner. In fact, she represents the only thing of value it has left." Fletcher was momentarily stunned into silence by the sudden transformation. "Who do you think you are?" he stammered, his bravado beginning to fray. Jinwoo ignored him. He reached into a hidden, waterproof pocket inside his tattered jacket and pulled out a phone. It was a sleek, black, impossibly expensive device that looked as out of place with his attire as a diamond on a dung heap. He pressed a single button. The phone rang once before it was answered. "Mr. Chen," Jinwoo said, his voice calm and precise. "It's time. Please come to the Starlight Diner on Elm Street. And bring the acquisition portfolio." The final 1 inch, he ended the call. Fletcher stared, his mind struggling to process the scene. Brenda's smug smirk had vanished, replaced by a look of deep unease. Imani simply watched, her own tears forgotten, caught in the grip of a surreal, unfolding mystery. Within a minute, a silent, gleaming black sedan glided to the curb. A man in a perfectly tailored suit, Mr. Chen, stepped out. He carried a fine leather portfolio and moved with an air of quiet efficiency. He walked directly past Fletcher, past Imani, and stopped before Jinwoo. He gave a short, respectful bow. "Mr. Park," he said. "Everything is in order as you requested." Jinwoo nodded, then turned his piercing gaze back to the terrified manager. The rain had finally stopped, and the air was eerily still. "My name is Jinwoo Park. I am the chairman of Park Global Holdings." He paused, letting the words sink in. And as of 2:15 p.m. last Tuesday, I own this diner, this entire chain, and you, Mr. Fletcher, work for me. A stunned silence descended upon the alley, so profound it seemed to swallow the sounds of the city. Fletcher's face cycled through a series of emotions: disbelief, confusion, dawning horror. Brenda looked as if she'd seen a ghost. Jinwoo gestured toward the diner entrance with a calm, deliberate motion. "Let's go inside. We have some business to discuss." He led the way, his tattered clothes a bizarre contrast to his newfound aura of absolute power. The customers, who had been watching the drama unfold, froze in their seats. The atmosphere inside was thick with tension. Jinwoo didn't take the manager's office. He chose a booth in the center of the room, a stage for his final act. He motioned for a shell-shocked Imani to sit opposite him. Mr. Chen stood beside the booth, placing the leather portfolio on the table. He directed Fletcher and Brenda to stand before them, like defendants at their own trial. "Mr. Fletcher," Jinwoo began, his voice low but carrying to every corner of the silent room. "Let's talk about brand image. I've read your quarterly reports. Impressive profit margins." He opened the portfolio. Margins achieved by cutting staff hours to the legal minimum, switching to cheaper, lower-quality suppliers, and, I can now surmise, fostering a corporate culture where basic human decency is viewed as a liability. He slid a file across the table. It was Fletcher's. "Your bonus structure is tied directly to minimizing waste and maximizing profit per table. An interesting metric. Is that why you'd rather kick a box of food into a puddle than allow a hungry man to eat it? Was that sandwich a debit on your personal ledger?" Fletcher was pale, sweating profusely under the fluorescent lights. I was just following corporate policy. I was protecting the company's assets, protecting our assets." Jinwoo's voice was like ice. "Our primary asset, Mr. Fletcher, is our reputation, our humanity, an asset you have systematically liquidated." He then turned his cold gaze to Brenda. "And you? Your file is filled with a dozen formal customer complaints regarding your rude and dismissive attitude. You are not an asset. You are a poison that has been contaminating this well for far too long." He closed the portfolio with a soft, final thud. "This isn't a business. It's a disease. And I am the cure." Jinwoo stood up, his presence commanding the entire room. He was no longer just speaking to Fletcher and Brenda. He was addressing every customer, every employee, and in a larger sense, the very soul of the company he now controlled. "My grandfather built his empire on a simple idea," he announced, his voice ringing with moral authority. He believed that a restaurant wasn't just a place to sell food. It was a place to feed a community, to offer warmth and welcome to anyone who walked through the door. It was supposed to be a sanctuary. He paused, letting his eyes sweep across the room. Somewhere along the way, that spirit was lost. It was traded for profit margins, for efficiency metrics, for a cold and sterile calculus that sees a hungry man not as a human being, but as a threat to the bottom line. His gaze softened as it landed on Imani, who was watching him with wide, tear-filled eyes. "Tonight, I came here looking for that lost spirit. I was starving for it. And I found it. Not in a mission statement or a corporate policy, but in the heart of one employee who was willing to lose her job for an act of kindness." He turned back to the disgraced manager and waitress. "Imani is not fired." The words were a declaration. "But you are, Mr. Fletcher. And you're too, Brenda. Mr. Chin will handle the details of your termination. Your final paychecks will be mailed to you." He then looked back at Imani, a genuine smile gracing his lips for the first time. "In fact, effective immediately, I am promoting Imani to the position of regional manager for this entire district. She will oversee the retraining of every manager in this chain. Her first task will be to teach them something that they have clearly forgotten: how to be human." A wave of gasps rippled through the diner. "Her starting salary will be $150,000 a year, plus the bonus that Mr. Fletcher was scheduled to receive for his excellent performance." He raised his voice for his final proclamation. "And furthermore, from this day forward, 10% of all profits from the Starlight Diner Corporation will be donated directly to funding local homeless shelters and food banks. We will feed the hungry, not chase them from our doors." The stunned silence broke. It started with one person clapping, then another, and then the entire diner erupted in a thunderous, spontaneous ovation. Hours later, the diner was empty and quiet. The last of the gawking press had been sent away by Mr. Chin, who had masterfully handled the fallout, turning a potential PR nightmare into an inspiring corporate fable. The floors were mopped, the tables wiped clean, and the only sound was the low hum of the refrigerator. Jinwoo, now dressed in a simple dark sweater and trousers that Mr. Chin had brought for him, sat across from Imani in the same booth where he had passed judgment. The weight of the world, both his and hers, had shifted on its axis. "Why?" Imani asked softly, her voice barely a whisper. She had been offered a kingdom, and she was still trying to understand the king. The disguise, all of it. Why would you do that? Jinwoo looked down at his hands, then met her gaze. The CEO mask was gone, and so was the beggar's. All that was left was the man. "I was looking for something I thought was extinct," he said, his voice laced with a vulnerability she had not expected. "Honesty. Integrity. Compassion that doesn't come with a price tag. My world is made of glass and steel, Imani. It's full of contracts and negotiations. Everything has a value, a benefit, a return on investment. I started to believe that's all there was." He reached across the table, his hand covering hers. It was a simple, hesitant gesture. "I was starving," he confessed. "But not for food. I was starving for a reason to believe in people again. You gave me that." She didn't pull her hand away. In his eyes, she saw not a powerful billionaire, but a lonely man who had been lost in his own empire. "You have a good heart, Jinwoo," she said, using his name for the first time. It was the only currency she possessed, and she offered it freely. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face, reaching his eyes. "You reminded me that I have one, too." He slid a simple white envelope across the table. Her first instinct was to think it was money, a reward. "It's not what you think," he said gently. She opened it. Inside was not a check, but a deed. The deed to the small apartment building her family had been renting for over a decade. It was now in her name, free and clear. "Every empire needs a foundation," he said softly. "Consider this a place to start building yours." The story broke the next morning like a tidal wave. It was on every news channel, every blog, every social media feed. Headline: The Beggar CEO and the Angel of Elm Street. Photos of Jinwoo in his rags were juxtaposed with his official corporate headshot. Images of Imani's warm, compassionate face were everywhere. Mr. Fletcher, bitter and disgraced, immediately tried to spin his own narrative, selling a sordid tale to a tabloid news site. He painted Jinwoo as an unhinged eccentric on a bizarre power trip and Imani as a manipulative opportunist who had played her part perfectly. But his poison found no purchase. Mr. Chun, anticipating such a move, had already released the diner's security footage. The world saw it all in stark, silent black and white. Fletcher's sneer, Brenda's mockery, the kick that sent the food into the puddle, and then Imani's quiet, defiant act of grace. The public's verdict was swift and unanimous. Park Global stock, instead of faltering, soared on the news. Investors and consumers alike rallied behind the story, not as a corporate strategy, but as a modern moral fable. The company's brand was no longer just about diners, it was about dignity. Jinwoo called a press conference but stood to the side, giving the podium to Imani. Dressed in a simple, elegant blue dress, she faced the blinding wall of cameras not as a new manager or a sudden celebrity, but as herself. She didn't speak about profit or restructuring. She spoke from the heart. "We are taught to value things we can count," she said, her voice steady and clear. "But the most important things have no number. Kindness, respect, dignity. Every single person you meet is living a story as complex and as important as your own. We should never treat them as a minor character, or worse, as an obstacle." Her words resonated across the globe. The Starlight Diner chain was officially rebranded, its neon signs replaced. The new name was her idea. Imani's Kitchen, a place at the table for everyone. The final, symbolic resolution came a month later. The flagship diner on Elm Street, now under renovation, was quiet late one night. Inside, Jin-woo and Imani stood side by side, paint rollers in hand, applying a fresh coat of warm, welcoming yellow to the main wall. They were not a CEO and a manager. They were just two people, building something new together from the ground up. He looked at her, a smudge of paint on her cheek, her laughter echoing in the empty room, and he knew his search was over. He had inherited an empire of assets, but she had given it a soul. The gnawing hunger that had driven him to the streets was finally gone, replaced by a love that came with no benefits, only blessings. The storm had passed, and in its quiet aftermath, something beautiful was finally growing.